Well, let's return to our top story, the war in Ukraine. As NATO defense ministers wrap up their meeting on how to counter Russia and arm Ukraine, Vladimir Putin is in Kazakhstan, where he's held talks with his Turkish counterpart Recep Tayyip Erdogan. As Russia faces growing setbacks on the battlefield and increasing diplomatic isolation, what does Vladimir Putin do next? Well, to help answer that question, I'm joined now by the Eastern European political analyst, Dr. Marek Laskowicz, who is chair of the Polish Social and Cultural Association in the UK. He's also the author of the 2014 book titled Russia, World War III, From a Ukraine Crisis or Elsewhere in the Future, World War III May Yet Arise, as warned since 1990. And he joins me now from London. Good to see you, Dr. Laskowicz. And even as we hear of talks between Turkey's leader Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Vladimir Putin about possible ceasefire negotiations, the Ukrainians are insisting they won't give up an inch of their territory for any type of peace. So in the face of that stiff resolve, is Turkish diplomacy dead on arrival?
I'm afraid so. One of the key problems is that there are two sides who are equally intent on achieving their goals, the Ukrainians and the Russians. And even if one of the sides, at this moment we're thinking, of course, of Russia, is apparently thinking of some sort of ceasefire talks, the other side does not. And in that case, what we have is a war that's going to carry on, which is a great pity, because the longer it carries on, the bigger the possibility is that sooner or later it will go up a phase. In other words, that sooner or later Vladimir Putin will be tempted to go nuclear.
Well, every time you and I talk, I'm always reminded of that extraordinary warning in your book. But let's just look at this from the Russian side. I mean, we know that since the start of the Ukraine invasion, Mr. Putin has shown no sign he's willing to compromise. But I mean, following the recent retreat of his forces in the face of the advance of the Ukrainians, I mean, could it be possible that the Russian leader is looking for a way out? And if so, what do you suppose his strategy might be? I mean, we've seen the possibility of talks.
Well, what is happening now, if the talks offer him an out, in other words, that he can point to some sort of success, then clearly there is a possibility there from his side. But it's quite clear that Ukraine does not want that. So therefore, although Putin may well be thinking, as you've said, of some sort of compromise, I doubt this is the case for Ukraine. But the other problem is it's by no means clear what is Vladimir Putin thinking, because if he cannot point to a success, then he cannot back down. There is no possibility. He will have to either win the war or secure a favorable peace. There are no other possibilities open for him, because obviously if he fails, he will fall. He will lose power.
So, I mean, what are your biggest fears now about the current situation in Ukraine? Is it the possibility of an endless war, or the fact that the world appears to be teetering on the precipice of nuclear conflict?
Well, it's the latter. You see, the endless war fought conventionally per se is only damaging, of course, to a local area, in this case, Ukraine. That in itself is, of course, a tragedy for the Ukrainians. But for the rest of the world, it is by no means impossible, since there have been wars ever since World War II all around the world without any further consequences. The real problem is that in order to win the war, Putin may well have to go nuclear. Now, he has shown that he has the resolve to actually make such a move, because after all, he went into Ukraine. He actually did the invasion in the same way as he put down the Chechenian separatism. He was in Syria, now in Ukraine. Therefore, there's no possibility whatsoever of saying that he will never do it. The question is, will he or won't he? And to this, there is no easy answer. But were he to do that, then at that point, the war enters into its fourth phase, or rather the conflict, as I put it, between Russia and the West, namely that we are no non-conventional. Incidentally, it doesn't have to be tactical news. Chemicals are the similar. Instead, the chemical warfare is also a local affair. Once they make the step, though, of going into local nuclear war, then there is always the possibility of it going yet a further notch in two ways, either spreading geographically, because quite possibly with nukes, he could win perhaps the Ukrainian war, or attack someone else with nukes, for example, Poland, which is on the supply route. Or then, of course, there's always the possibility of a strategic thermonuclear exchange. Please note, there is no possibility according to my analysis, of such a strategic nuclear war right now. It won't happen today, it won't happen tomorrow, unless the step is taken to go tactically nuclear. And also, of course, when we're talking about strategic nuclear, there could be also a biological aspect to this as well, biowarfare. But my point is, the longer this war carries on, the greater the chance that something will go wrong in this respect. And therefore, it is necessary, essential, to bring about a peace. And the West could do this, since after all, it's only thanks to Western arms that Ukraine can press forward. And therefore, the West, instead of backing Ukraine all the way to end up in some sort of nuclear conflict, should now think in terms of a potential peace settlement.
Well, that's a very good point you've just made. And if, let's say that nothing is predictable at this point, and the concept of predictability is over, as one British journalist suggested, does that mean that Russia, as you said, a nuclear superpower, has entered a period of major instability? And if so, how much should that worry us all?
Well, it should worry us for another reason. I mean, if it's one of the oddities about the Western media that they've been going on about Putin and the fact that if he fell from power, how wonderful it would be. Whereas according to my analysis, he could be replaced by somebody far worse. I do realize this sounds somewhat strange at present when I'm saying this, when Putin has after all ordered an invasion of Ukraine, and he is after all former KGB man. However, there are worse people than him in Russian history, and therefore there could be, instead of Putin, the compromiser, a further hardliner taking the view, and therefore Russia would then press forward. So as you rightly said, there's instability. Predictability, there is no predictability in the sense, I think the British journalist meant it, in the sense it's hard and fast and we're certain what's going to happen. However, that's not true. In my books, I mentioned already from the word go that we're really dealing with a probabilistic situation, and therefore it's how the probabilities look. Therefore, there is a possibility of World War III, but it is uncertain in the sense it's a probability. We can name what number we like. Let's say nominally 10%, if we want to say, which is implying that it's not very likely but possible. But it is certainly not zero. Certainly not.
Absolutely fascinating analysis, and I wish we'd hearkened to your book when you published it first in 2014. Yeah. Dr. Marek Laskovich, I want to thank you exceedingly once again. He is, of course, an Eastern European political analyst and is chair of the Polish Social and Cultural Association in the UK, as well as an author.